looking back at, I guess I got to kind of get back to Matthew 24 for a moment. Matthew 24, the abomination of desolation, like I said, that's probably in what, verse 15 area? Yeah. So when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Without any real discussion or without any real thought, where do you think this phrase comes from in our Old Testament? I try not to ask too difficult a question. It says Daniel. So if you were in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, let's see, is that? Yeah, Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, that's kind of in brackets, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So in Daniel 9, we're introduced to this phrase, the abomination of desolation. The way that we're choosing to view prophecy, or the way that I'm choosing to teach it, is that first, prophecy always has an application for whom?
For the people in the immediate circle.
The people in the immediate circle.
Yeah.
Matthew was talking primarily to Jewish people.
Yes.
So if I, as a Gentile, read Matthew, that's perfectly fine. But I have to read Matthew first, realizing that Matthew is writing to a particular audience. Then, once I know how Matthew is writing to a particular audience, I can attempt to understand what the language is, what he's intending for the original audience to hear. That's kind of how I'm choosing to use interpretation. And that's how I'm choosing also to understand prophecy. First, when Daniel wrote in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, about the abomination of desolation, I am choosing that Daniel had an immediate audience of people who were directly around him, who would have been direct readers that he's thinking. Now, aside from that, this is what we see Jesus doing in Matthew 24. When Jesus quotes Daniel, is he wanting the people to think about what Daniel's experiencing? Or is he wanting people to think about what they're about to experience?
Both.
Doesn't have to be either or, it's above. First off, you got to think about what Daniel was writing about. Daniel was about to experience. Then you tell the people, this is what you're about to experience. It's just in line with what happened to Daniel. Which then, in our case today, or at least our study today, you move forward with Revelation. And when we read phrases like abomination of desolation, what steps should we take to understand a phrase like abomination of desolation?
Back to look at how Daniel used it.
We have to look back. Daniel used it. Then we jump forward to who? Jump forward to Jesus.
And Paul, if you consider 2 Thessalonians 2.
Hey, Josh. Check your battery on your mic.
Oh. Is that any better?
Perfect.
Thanks for catching that.
Well, I could hear you, but it sounded like you was in another room.
Well, I want you to be able to hear me good and loud and clear.
That's it. That's good.
Perfect. Yeah, that one, I've got the red light of, I guess, of death on that one. We'll have to change batteries for that one. So we're going to attempt to look at, I didn't, Second Thessalonians.
Yeah,
I didn't look at
2. The words there,
Okay,
but it can be tied
to all this.
to the man of lawlessness, can be tied to the concept anyway.
Okay. Well, how about when we get past Jesus, you do Second Thessalonians. So looking back at Daniel for just a moment, we're at Daniel 9:27. Daniel writes about the abomination of desolation. The thing that probably is most, that I'm assuming Daniel's most writing about is the desecration of the temple in 167 BC. That was done by Antiochus Epiphanes. And it's said that on the altar of the temple, he sacrificed a pig. I don't even know what all else he did in there. But anyways, he completely desecrated the temple in a way that would have just been completely repulsive to the Jewish audience. I'm trying to wonder if there's anything I might have missed before that, but I think that's probably what Daniel was talking to.
Yeah, he set up an idol to Zeus and proclaimed that he was the same as the God of the Jews, which the very fact that he killed the pig in there, that was enough to undo him, basically.
So if you know that when Daniel says the phrase, abomination of desolation, that he is talking about the complete desecration of the temple of God, false worship, or even outsiders bringing out, I'm going to use this phrase, it's unauthorized fire, but the idea that there's something going on inside the holy place that is completely appalling. Okay, so let's take that thought and now let's move to the time of Jesus. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, as we just talked about, Jesus talking about the abomination of desolation, the stuff that's going on in this time period. What do you think Jesus is probably referencing or probably thinking about? Or what does he foresee? I'm going to say probably the Roman destruction of the temple, which was done by Titus. Yeah, Titus, when they came in and completely leveled the temple and everything that was around it. This is recorded by Josephus in the War of the Jews. And now when the multitude were gotten together to an assembly, and everyone was in indignation at these men seizing upon the sanctuary, at their rapine, another word for raping, and murderers, but had not yet begun their attacks upon them. Agnes stood in the midst of them, and casting his eyes frequently at the temple, and having a flood of tears in his eyes, said, "Certainly it had been good for me to die before I had seen the house of God full of so many abominations, or these sacred places that ought not to be trodden upon at random, filled with the feet of those bloodshedding villains."
And it was not only the Romans, it was the Jews within the temple themselves that were causing abomination of desolation. They did something like install a clown as a high priest, as total of farce. Then there was many murders in the temple area. This is before the Romans got there, but it was desecrating the temple.
I'm thankful you brought that up, primarily because I think I'm more believing that Jesus is thinking of the Jewish desecration before, more so than the Roman destruction. Which then, if you have in your head now, Daniel was talking about which destruction of the temple?
It really wasn't destroyed.
Well, not destroyed. Yeah, destroyed.
It was just
desecration.
desecrated.
Which one?
It was the second temple.
Who was the general? Y'all remember the name? It was in the time Antiochus Epiphanes. We have the second one, which we're blaming onto Rome, Titus. But even so, the part that we probably need to most think of is that the temple was desecrated ahead of time, before the Romans even came in, by their own Jewish people. So people who should have been believing or should have been taking care of this place are the ones who most destroyed it. This is found a little later. I forgot to write this reference down, but it was said that wherever I read it was basically that after the Romans came in and destroyed, I'm gonna have to give you the Josh Watkins paraphrase. Basically, they marched through the streets of Jerusalem with their swords drawn, just stabbing people, killing them left and right. They set the place afire. And after they went back through to pillage, it was said that the Romans were so distraught and disgusted by the level of death that had occurred within Jerusalem that they actually didn't pillage it. But they would go into homes and they would see that people had died, but that people were actually dead before the Romans even came in. So assuming that that's true, and assuming my memory is correct on that, you have now what we're going to come to is Revelation chapter 13. This focus is going to be in verse 14. So Revelation 13, verse 14. The reason that I think this fits here is because of the full view. This is verse 14. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. In our two previous encounters, the Abomination of Desolation, we're dealing with this idolatry that's taking place within the temple. Make sense so far, Laura? Clear as mud? Okay.
Still mulling it over.
That's okay. You can mull. We're dealing with this idea, and I'm going to call it idolatry within the temple. So as John writes now, talking about the time period after Jesus' resurrection and following, what do you think that means for us?
I think there's always a time that there is a false gospel, a false narrative of what the gospel is. If you use the term Antichrist as it's first used in 1 John, there was a belief that Jesus did not come in the flesh. Well, some false teaching about Jesus, another Jesus, a different type of Jesus. So that's always available.
The idea that the gospel that's preached or taught within churches, and if you can't, oh, y'all people online can't see me, or is being preached, which is a fake gospel, and how that could possibly be the idolatry that's being taught within the temple. Who's the modern day temple? I mean, we don't obviously don't have a physical building that's a modern temple. There are some people attempting to rebuild that. What's the temple today?
It's defined as the church in Peter.
The people, our body. I had Linda was in the back doing this, but the people, the body. And so within the people or the church, as Greg was saying, this is an interesting quote that I came across that I think would fit within this. Turning the temple of the living God into a place of worship for the Antichrist is truly an abomination. Those who are alive and remaining during, this is going to be from a perspective of a premillennialists, but says those who are alive and remaining during the tribulation should be watchful and recognize that this event is beginning at the 3.5 years of the worst tribulation period and that the return of the Lord is imminent. Then they quote Luke 21:36. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen and that you may be able to stand before the Lord, before the Son of Man.
And that particular guy that you're quoting there is a mid-tribulationist.
A mid-tribulation.
Yeah.
There's so many of them. This is from gotquestions.org. I tell you, they're a great website, but this one was definitely a mid-premillennial, whatever, mid-premillennial. But I like the quote where it was turning the temple of the living God into a place of worship for the Antichrist is an abomination. Which lends us to the question, is it possible? Oh, those are my notes. Is it possible, or should we be ever vigilant? Make sure that the church of God does not become a temple to the Antichrist.
I see we're called to be vigilant.
And you have to be careful of false teachings, of letting anything and everything go within their body of believers, because you certainly don't want to lead anybody astray. Woe to you.
That connects with, or at least in my head, that connects with the 2 Thessalonians passage.
I forgot about it. Take us there, Greg. 2 Thessalonians 2.
Yeah. So this person is described as, well, where do I want to go? Starting with verse 3, I guess. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the lawless one is revealed, the one destined for destruction. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. And then when it goes on to talk about, that mystery is already at work, but then he says down on in there that he will be destroyed when Jesus returns. So, we can say, okay, and many people have referenced this to various popes. That was the Reformationist point of view for the most part. That has been some of the Restorationist point of view. But this guy, whoever he is going to be destroyed when Jesus returns. So I don't think it's quite a pope. I think it's something bigger than a pope. Yeah. That's for what it's worth.
Well, as we've embraced, this is everyone's own interpretation, because we're talking about something that in some degree we're not going to understand till the Lord comes back. But we are all entitled to our interpretation of things. We're just trying to provide options for things that you can interpret. Any thoughts or questions or comments or Abomination of Desolation, Antichrist, any of those areas? Bored to death or riveting? I think the thing that I would leave us with, and I'll give you that way you can have another minute or two to think, is we have to be vigilant to ensure that the spirit of the Antichrist is not alive within us. Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." It's not that Peter ceased to exist, but the qualities of Satan were exhibited in Peter. I think that we, as both individuals, but as a collective local church and as a greater church, have to make sure that we're living or checking ourselves to making sure that we're living in the spirit that does not allow the Antichrist to live. Just hoping that someone would have a
Well,
comment.
there's some pretty slick people out there that talk.
Oh,
They talk a good game. Used car salesman. I mean, they could sell ice cubes to an Eskimo, but that doesn't make them true. They can spread the word however they want, but it doesn't make what they're saying the truth. That's where we have to, if you're reading the Bible, you ought to be able to discern certain people aren't. Because it's easier to deceive somebody that don't know.
Hmm.
So if you don't know, that's a danger.
and isn't the world full of people who don't know? I enjoy listening to Joel Osteen, but I also sit and I say, man, if I had that hair and that makeup and those teeth, I could probably convince a whole lot of people too. And I enjoy, he's smooth. What's the substance? Tim and I listened to Stephen Furtick. Stephen Furtick, man, you listen to that guy. And you, after listening to him for a little bit, you are just pumped up. You're ready to tear the world apart. What's the substance?
It was interesting. We watched Indiana Jones Search for the Holy Grail. And when they got there in there and they had to pick out the chalice, there was a lot of pretty ones around, a lot of ones that looked really nice. But the one that ended up being the right one, this was a stone carved into a cup. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't stand out. I think we got to be real careful because beauty sometimes overtakes us.
Even Satan himself transfers himself into an angel of light.
Which fits into chapter 13, talking about the beast that, what was it, the beast that came out of the water? Or the beast that came out of the land that is the one that came out of the land.
It's like a lamb, but he spoke as a dragon.
Yeah, I was looking for the verses here, but had great signs, caused fire to come down from heaven. And because of the signs, the people were driven to follow.
But his signs, compared to the signs of Jesus, he testified to himself, but Jesus didn't, and his signs weren't accepted.
You can go back to Moses and see the signs with the staff and the serpent thrown out there. Well, the guys that did magic had that happen, but they didn't, they got gobbled up by the one Moses had. They couldn't, I mean, that's what happens. Poof, look. And we're all wow factor, but it really, sometimes the wow factor ain't wow.
Only for a little while, right?
Yes, the wow factor will be on the day he comes back.
Well, let's move into chapter 14. We're now in Revelation chapter 14. I thank y'all for giving me that liberty to go back to Abomination of Desolation. And I guess it's not like I really asked your opinion, but you at least sat and listened, so you could have walked out. So the way I'm looking at chapter 14 as compared to chapter 13, I'm perceiving that chapters 12 and 13 are really showing us the earthly view after the resurrection. We talked about how, chapter 11 really kind of is the final. You could really end Revelation at chapter 11 and you wouldn't miss much. Everything from chapter 11 on is really giving us details for events that have happened or are happening in the first 11 chapters. So as we've jumped back in chapters 12, I'm looking at chapters 12 and 13 as giving us the earthly perspective. Satan at the end of 12 was cast down to earth. And he is now, this is the last verse of chapter 12. It says, the dragon was enraged at the woman, went to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who did we choose to interpret or believe that the rest of her offspring are?
People of God.
The people of God. So as Satan is now chasing after the people of God, it says there, this is the last verse of chapter 12, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony of Jesus. We're still at chapter 13, this earthly view. Satan calls these two demons or these two beasts up, one out of the sea and one out of the earth. And the individuals that those are, I'm assuming you probably taught that these were more somewhat from a Roman perspective, at least in their initial interpretation. And we come to chapter 14, and the way I'm seeing is chapter 14 shifts us back to heaven. It gives us back to this heavenly vision of what's going on. And we're told that the Lamb and the 144,000, this is in verses 1 through 5, the Lamb is standing with the redeemed. And notice there's a mark on these people. How does that contrast with the mark given in chapter 4 to 13?
This was a mark that symbolized or set them apart as the people of God.
So in chapter 13, the people are given a mark that sets them aside for Satan or for his minions or however you're choosing that. And what's interesting too is chapter 13 says that in order to do commerce, in order to do business, in order to effectively live in society, you had to have this number. No wonder people had a problem with the Social Security numbers, right? We digress. Coming to chapter 14, we see now that Jesus or God has issued numbers to his people. So it is like comparing and contrasting these two things. But the Lamb is standing with the redeemed. They have been marked by the Lamb. And then in verse 4, it says, those who have not defiled themselves with women who are virgins. When you first read that, what's the first thought comes to your mind? Who would that be?
I kind of think of celibates.
I was thinking priest, but then I was thinking Catholic priests.
Okay. No, I asked the question because I want to hear what first comes to mind. Not because it necessarily has to be right, but for us to say, okay, what first comes to mind? You thought celibate priests. You said,
I said celibates.
celibates. We first read that. As a matter of fact, when I first read it, it was, well, wait a second, this 100, and to me, it reads like the 144,000 is this group, which if you go back to chapter 7, where we're introduced to the 144,000, we're not really told that they're celibates at chapter 7.
Right.
It's not necessarily new information. I think what we have to think is that first off, I mean, you could choose to interpret it as those who have kept themselves from women, which then seems, I'm going to say it seems kind of sexist. Where's the women at? Could the 144,000 not have been women too? Are there not women martyrs in the church histories?
Definitely.
There definitely are. So is the best thought to take this as people who are virgins in physical way, or is the best way to look at this as spiritual purity, as spiritual commitment, spiritual non-adultery, if you will? Revelation chapter 2, verse 14, jumping forward to chapter 2, verse 20 and 22, unfaithfulness is referred to as sexual immorality. If you go to just verse 8 in this very chapter, Babylon is considered a whore for committing adulteries. So I'm going to choose, this is me, to say when it says phrases like, who have kept themselves from women who are virgins, that it's more focusing on people who have a life not of lies, a life of purity, a life of holiness, a life that's different than the world's. Yet again, the 144,000 from chapter 7 were martyrs. Does that mean that they were perfect in their life? We don't know. But do you know of a perfect person minus one? So there has to be something in their life that would be sin, but that's not the point that Revelation that John's trying to make. Greg, I heard you clear your throat. I don't know if you wanted to say something or not.
But many times in the Old Testament, when God wanted to point out that Israel wasn't faithful to him, he compared himself to being their husband, and the wife was committing adultery. And so I suppose the same can be said here. And in some of the stuff that we described in this first 3 chapters, yeah, they were pretty much doing that and finding justification to do it. So, yeah.
For your recollection, what happens in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation? Greg doesn't answer. Chapters 2 and 3.
Where he's talking to the 7 churches.
There you go. It's the letters to the 7 churches. And out of the 7 churches, how many churches were pure commendations?
I'm gonna say 2, because that's what you're holding up.
Only 2 of them were found without fault in
Like,
some
I don't
way.
remember, that was too long ago,
That's okay.
but I'm going off your cues.
I will always say, I'm always going to try and give you something. I'm always going to try to. Only 2 of them were found to, and yet again, we're not saying that they were 100% perfect. There wasn't an expressed problem. There was, I'm going to commend you. Everyone else, I have this against you. So that's kind of how I'm choosing to interpret that text in verse 4. You're welcome to interpret it however you wish. Beginning in verse 6, we're introduced to 3 angels. The first angel shows up and preaches, declares the gospel and calls on all earth to worship God. This is right at this is verse 7. And notice in verse 6, it says that every nation, tribe, language, and people, that is meant for us to contrast it against the beasts. I forget where we're at in chapter 13, but the same language, the same words are used, that the beasts has conned all the nations, tribes, and languages of the people. So it's meant,
8.
verse 8. Yeah, verse 8. Yeah, all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. So it's meant for us to contrast these 2 accounts. We have an earthly account of Satan, the demonic realm. We have a heavenly account of God and the angels. It says, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth, the sea and the sea and the springs of water. There we go. What is the gospel message that's shared here? And what do we learn from it? The gospel is anything that can be the good news. It doesn't have to, in this account, I don't want you to think of Jesus. Not that it doesn't, but I don't want you to think of Jesus. What's the good news that the angel shares here?
How about the gospel is for all?
The gospel is for all. A beautiful thought here, because is the angel speaking to a limited group? No, he's speaking to everybody.
You know who Alexander Campbell said this was, don't you?
I don't know.
He said it was Martin Luther.
He interpreted that as Martin Luther.
Because Martin Luther brought the gospel back from the so-called dark ages of medieval Catholic Church.
Well, that's interesting. I think he might be off on that, my opinion.
Well,
It's worth what you paid for it.
mine too, but I just, you know, you've got to kind of get your history there too.
The more you know, though.
Yeah.
The more you know. Because of time, I'm going to put a pin in this place right here. We've made it through the first angel. Actually, I guess I got like another half point here. I think he preaches a simple message to all in the creation, which is what Roger said, but that he preaches a simple message of fear God and worship him. You can compare and contrast yet again that in chapter 13, Satan is viewed as a destroyer, as one who is preaching a message of destruction. You have here God is preaching a message of life, of an opportunity. And I think that that's interesting, at least as we see the first angel, because it then brings to mind, and I'll probably say this again, if I do, you just ignore me, but we look at Revelation as a book of maybe judgments against a people who are choosing not to follow God. And the problem is that it's not that people didn't have the opportunity. One of the big emphases that we'll see, emphases, is that people had the opportunity. They have heard the message. They chose not to follow. And in that light, God will bring about ultimate judgment. That's my time.
Going back to verse 4, you look over in Matthew 19, starting with, well, he's talking about divorce and stuff. He's talking about eunuchs from birth, and eunuchs, they were made eunuchs, then eunuchs, they were made for the kingdom. So I think this is pretty well what he's talking about.
Do you remember your reference in Matthew for that? Do you remember the reference for Matthew? You said it was in Matthew
19, verse 12 is where he's talking about the eunuchs.
19 and 12. And again, I think that the more you know, the more you can write down on the sides of your Bible, the better off we are. Any other comments or thoughts? Thank you, Billy. Well, if not, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. We will pick up next week with the second angel that begins in verse 8 of Revelation 14. We didn't make it through 14, but I tell you what, next week, what we'll do, and this actually will work out well, is that we will cover chapters 14 and 15 next week. I think that's doable on our schedule. So thank you very much for your attention tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you all next Sunday or Wednesday.